I'm Professor Declan Bates from the School of Engineering at the University of Warwick. And I'm co-director with Jonathan Hardman, a clinical anaesthetist at Nottingham, of what we call the Interdisciplinary Collaboration in Systems Medicine. So this is a group of engineers and clinicians that work together on problems related to respiratory medicine. So the talk I'm going to give you is just a single example of a piece of research that's had some impact in a clinical setting. The background to this is mechanical ventilation. So our group has been working on researching how to do mechanical ventilation better, essentially, for many years. And in the context of mechanical ventilation, a key idea that's emerged over the past 30 years is this challenge associated with ventilator-induced lung injury. So it's now well understood amongst clinicians that the main goal of mechanical ventilation is not to normalize gas exchange and oxygenation in the patient. The goal is to preserve sufficient oxygenation while minimizing the risk of lung injury being caused by the ventilator itself. So this concept of VILI is now well understood and recognized. What is still a lot more controversial is something called PSILI, which stands for patient self-inflicted lung injury. And this is the hypothesis that pre-intubation, so patients who have not been intubated and put on a mechanical ventilator, but who are suffering from acute respiratory failure. So if they're still spontaneously breathing and they're receiving some form of non-invasive respiratory support, for example, CPAP, that higher respiratory efforts on the part of these patients could also lead to lung injury in the same way that VILI does in the context of mechanical ventilation. This issue has become particularly sort of relevant or important in the context of COVID-19, where various different types of non-invasive respiratory support have been very widely used around the world. And the reason that it matters is that it has fairly profound implications for treatment strategies, because if it is the case that a patient is risking damage to their lungs while on non-invasive respiratory support, that would be a good indicator that that patient needs to be intubated and put on a ventilator. And this issue of trying to decide timing regarding intubation, whether to intubate, and if so, when to intubate, is a key treatment decision in many of these patients. However, as I said, PSILI is not at all universally accepted. In fact, it's a highly controversial concept whose very existence is the topic of debate. So to give you a flavor of the kind of debates that are happening, here's a letter to the editor of a leading intensive care journal from Martin Tobin. Martin Tobin is an Irish pulmonologist who is one of the leading experts in this area in the United States. He works in the United States. He was actually the expert witness that was called to the George Floyd trial to explain to the jury how the police actions would have led to his death via lack of oxygen. And he wrote this letter saying, essentially, he doesn't really believe that it exists. So these two studies that he says authors always cite regarding the existence of PSILI, he says they don't constitute a sound scientific basis for its occurrence in COVID-19 patients. Whereas in a reply, Luciano Gattinoni and colleagues, Luciano Gattinoni is one of the most famous researchers in the field of intensive care medicine and has been for 20 or 30 years in the world. He says that not only does it exist, but that it's a key driver of damage. And if non-invasive respiratory support is not able to bring patients' respiratory efforts under control, then they should be intubated and mechanically ventilated. And he claims evidence for this based on treating hundreds of patients in the UK and Italy over the course of the pandemic. So quite polarized opinions there from two of the leading experts in the world. So why or how can such a controversy arise? Well, on the one hand, the assertion that PCILI should exist is entirely logical. There isn't any reason to think that forces and pressures that are produced inside the lung by spontaneous breathing should be any less injurious than those that are produced by mechanical ventilation. That's just kind of physiologically logical. But on the other hand, there's very limited data to support the existence of PCILI. So as Professor Tobin claimed correctly, a lot of the studies were done in animals quite a long time ago. There's some data from a study on asthmatic children showing that high respiratory efforts could promote pulmonary edema. But the fundamental problem is that it's very, very difficult to measure the key indicators of lung injury that you would want to find out about in spontaneously breathing patients, certainly ones that are undergoing acute respiratory failure and certainly in the midst of a pandemic type situation. So anywhere you've got controversy, lack of knowledge, lack of agreement, and difficulty in making measurements is an opportunity for mathematical modeling and mathematical modelers to try to help. And so what we decided to do was to adapt a model that we had been using for many years in the context of mechanical ventilation, to adapt that model to the context of spontaneous breathing in the specific case of COVID-19 acute respiratory failure. So we modeled the pathophysiology of COVID-19 at least to the extent that it's currently understood. We applied the kind of breathing patterns that clinicians are seeing in COVID-19 patients, so similar levels of tidal volumes, similar respiratory rates, et cetera, and then we actually could measure the various pressures, pressure swings, strains, stresses, everything that you would like to be able to measure in patients. We can measure these things very easily inside our computational model. And when we compared those levels to to levels that would be agreed generally by clinicians to run the risk of causing lung injury in the context of mechanical ventilation, we found that they were comparable, i.e. the kinds of forces and pressures that were being generated would be, I think, uncontroversially regarded as damaging if that patient was being mechanically ventilated. So in terms of impact, I suppose the first thing to say about this is that we got this study published in a leading intensive care journal, which doesn't generally publish mathematical or even animal studies. One always wonders whether anybody is going to read your paper, but because this is an open access journal, we can view the figures for this. So it was only published towards the end of last year, but it's already been downloaded 7,000 times, over 7,000 times. And then interestingly, in a recent publication in the Journal of the American Medical Society, which just happened last week, this was a publication reporting the results of the largest clinical trial to date, trying to evaluate two different kinds of non-invasive respiratory support in COVID-19. This is the recovery randomized clinical trial. This was led by Gavin Perkins, who's actually a colleague of mine at Warwick in the clinical trials unit here. So this was published in JAMA, and it was granted an accompanying editorial because it was considered very significant. So this editorial describes the study and comments on it and draws some conclusions based on it. But at the beginning of the editorial, they talk about this issue of non-invasive respiratory support and its possible advantages, but it's also its potential dangers in terms of P-cili and delaying intubation when that might be required. And the evidence that they gave for existence of P-cili, one of the two papers that they cited was our paper. So this gives you, I think, a hint that medics are willing to take seriously the results of modeling and computational studies in a purely clinical context. So our group are convinced that modeling and simulation have a huge potential in respiratory medicine. We can see numerous different areas in which they can play a role. I think that modeling can be very useful in trying to compare and evaluate different hypotheses regarding disease pathophysiology in scenarios where we don't understand the disease pathophysiology well, as in, for example, COVID-19. It can provide at least initial evidence on the potential effectiveness of novel treatment strategies. I think crucially, it can help to stratify and characterize different patient groups within very heterogeneous patient populations, so that clinical trials can be more targeted and focused on groups that are more likely to benefit. And it can also enable you to do fairly structured research in a number of different challenging or novel domains. So, for example, we've recently started working in looking at blast lung injury, looking at emergency medicine situations, pre-hospital application of CPAP, for example, was a paper we have just published in a special edition of the British Journal of Anesthesia on emergency medicine. And the key idea there is that you're never going to be able to perform clinical trials in that context, because it's by definition impossible in that scenario. So the potential is huge. Now is the time to make it happen, and we hope that this network can make a big difference towards achieving that. And to tell you a bit more about how we're going to do that, I'll hand over to Bindi again.